Welcome back, everyone, to the deep dive. Today, we're gonna get into some fascinating stuff happening in Central Asia.
Oh, sounds interesting.
Yeah, we're talking Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, and Tajikistan.
Mm.
And when I was prepping for this, something really jumped out at me, and I just thought, wow, this is kind of crazy, right? So there was a study in Kyrgyzstan back in 2007, and it found that over 70%, that's like a huge majority of members in self-help groups, were women.
Wow.
Yeah. So you have all these women getting involved in these really important local initiatives, right? Working together, trying to make things better in their communities. But here's the thing. All this amazing energy, all this participation, it wasn't necessarily translating into more women taking on leadership positions outside of those groups. And it definitely wasn't like, totally upending those really entrenched traditional gender roles that we see in many parts of the world.
Yeah, that's really interesting, and it makes you wonder, right? Wh what are those barriers, those specific obstacles that are preventing all of that talent and dedication from really being recognized and put to use in a broader way?
Exactly. And, another piece of this puzzle was that young people weren't really part of the equation either. So today, our deep dive is going to look at how a project called From Self-Help to Leadership tried to tackle these issues head on in those three countries.
Oh, I'm excited to hear about this.
Yeah, it's really fascinating stuff.
Yeah.
Our main source material for this deep dive is what's called a praxis note from INTREC, that's the International NGO Training and Research Center. And just so you know, a praxis note, it's basically like a document where people on the ground, they share their practical experiences, the real-world lessons learned right from the field.
Oh, so it's not just theory. It's like, here's what we actually did and here's what we learned.
Exactly. And this particular praxis note is based on Intransiki's work in Central Asia between 2009 and 2010. So we're going to unpack what challenges women and young people were facing in these self-help groups, how this project tried to address them, and honestly, what we can all learn from it. It's kind of like a look under the hood of how we build leadership from the ground up and how we make sure that leadership really includes everyone.
Yeah, and thinking even broader, understanding these dynamics in Central Asia, it can actually give us some really useful insights into similar initiatives happening all over the world, right? I mean, what are those common threads when we talk about empowering marginalized groups? When we talk about creating leadership that's truly inclusive, that's really what we're aiming to unpack for you today.
Okay, so let's set the scene a bit. Imagine the situation after the collapse of the Soviet Union. This was a massive shift, right? And it hit women particularly hard, especially in rural areas. The dismantling of collective farms really changed the economic landscape.
Yeah, and a lot of communities reverted to these more traditional family farming structures. So women often ended up shouldering the main burden of keeping things afloat, especially when men had to migrate for work, either to Russia or Kazakhstan.
Right. And this economic pressure was really, um, it was compounded by this renewed emphasis on like national traditions and values in the region after 1991.
Yeah.
And sadly, sometimes this translated into an expectation for women to take on more subservient roles within their families.
Right. And young wives especially, right. Especially when they moved in with their husband's extended family, they often face this, incredibly strict division of labor, tons of pressure to conform, and a lot of influence from their mothers-in-law.
Yeah, you can imagine how difficult that would be. And it wasn't just about their roles within the home either. Women often lacked secure property rights, which obviously could create huge problems in cases of divorce,
Hmm.
impacting both them and their children. And to add to that, the budget cuts and the rising unemployment after independence, they really hit professions that had traditionally been, largely filled by women, like teaching, nursing, law, accounting, those kinds of things. So you can see how in many ways the social and economic landscape became much, much more challenging for women.
Yeah. And we can't forget the political backdrop here, right? Kyrgyzstan in particular, they went through two really significant periods of political upheaval in a relatively short period of time. And what's striking is that in both uprisings, especially that April 2010 one, you saw women and young people right there in the thick of it.
Yeah.
They weren't just observing from the sidelines, they were participating in the protests, but importantly, they were also really active in the efforts to stabilize the situation afterwards. And that right there, that tells you something, right? It shows you the potential they have to shape their communities, even in these moments of crisis.
Absolutely. And all of this leads us to this rise of self-help movements. And it's really interesting. In the years leading up to the project we're talking about, self-help groups became super widespread in Kyrgyzstan. And a lot of this was driven by international development programs that were really focused on, like, tackling poverty at the grassroots level.
Yeah. And a key part of many of these programs was microcredit.
Right, microcredit.
So, providing these small loans, relatively favorable terms, often without needing traditional collateral. And these were aimed at, the poorer, more vulnerable segments of the population.
And what's interesting is that these microcredit-focused groups, they weren't the only type of self-organized support.
Right.
You also saw some really successful groups popping up among other marginalized populations. I mean, we're talking older people, sexual minorities, survivors of violence, people dealing with drug use. It really showed that the self-help model, it had this broad appeal for people facing different forms of exclusion.
Yeah, definitely.
But the self-help groups that really took off, the ones that were most prevalent, were those centered around microcredit for these joint economic activities. Like, that's what Ani Treek's program was mainly working with. They engaged with over 1,000 of these groups across the 3 countries, most of them in Kyrgyzstan.
Wow, that's a lot of groups.
Yeah, it is. And remember that statistic we talked about at the beginning about women making up over 70% of the members in microcredit-focused SHGs. Well, it really highlights a key aspect of these groups. Women were at the heart of them. But on the flip side, young people weren't really involved. So you have this really strong female presence focused on economic self-reliance, but this notable absence of youth. And as we're going to explore, there were limitations in the broader influence of these women as well.
Right. So let's dig into why that might be. What were the specific obstacles, the challenges that, let's say, young women in particular faced within these self-help groups? The report points out that, they often found themselves in unequal power dynamics, right? And this happened at multiple levels, like within their families, within their communities, even within the SHGs themselves. You often had young wives with kids, maybe single mothers, carrying the primary responsibility for managing the household, for bringing in income.
Picture this. You're a young woman. You're already juggling all of that. And now you're trying to step up and take on a leadership role in a self-help group. And you're surrounded by older family members, maybe even your mother-in-law. It's incredibly challenging to question their opinions or their authority,
right,
let alone try to, step into a formal leadership position within the SHG.
Absolutely. And then there's this kind of paradox, right? The very thing that's supposed to empower them, microcredit, could also create all this additional pressure. I mean, yes, it brought financial benefits to many families, but the report also talks about how it led to serious debt in some cases. And even when women were praised, right, for their responsibility in handling household finances, for paying back those loans, well, they could still end up in really tough situations if things went wrong, facing pressure from other members of the group, from their own families. The real issue here is that when those financial difficulties hit, when family problems arose, a woman's ability to make her own decisions, to figure out how to deal with those challenges, that was often not respected.
Yeah, and it sounds like even within the NGOs themselves, within the SHGs, there wasn't always a deep understanding of, like, that fundamental principle, that women having that independent decision-making power, that's essential for their rights.
Definitely, yeah.
Now, another key issue was this kind of invisible barrier that women faced when it came to leadership. So they might be the majority of leaders within individual self-help groups, right? But when you look at the higher levels, things like federations that brought together multiple SHGs, and then, of course, politics and business.
Right.
Well, their representation really dropped off.
Those remain predominantly male spaces.
Exactly. And this lack of representation, this lack of role models at those higher levels, it created this discouraging environment for women. They might have had all this practical experience making decisions within their SHGs, but translating that into a position in local government or, some other influential body, that was a real uphill battle. And frankly, it probably deterred a lot of women from even trying.
Yeah. And that really highlights the systemic issue, right? Where grassroots leadership, even when it's really strong, doesn't automatically translate into wider societal influence.
Right, exactly. Now, the report also talks about the leadership styles that were common within the SHGs themselves. And this is interesting. Even in groups where women held leadership positions, the style tended to be quite, authoritarian. They would try to encourage the rotation of leadership, but it wasn't always successful. So it was difficult to achieve genuine empowerment for all members, especially for those younger and more vulnerable women who might be hesitant to challenge someone who's seen as a strong figure.
And then you have this other really interesting dynamic, which is, the absence or the kind of passivity of men in a lot of these programs. You had significant levels of male labor migration, which meant that the self-help groups often ended up with very few male members, let alone young men. And even when men did participate, their primary interest was often, like the economic gains or sometimes political gains. Whereas women, they often talked about, the benefits in terms of social connections, psychological well-being, even like the cultural aspects fostered by the programs.
It's fascinating, right? These very different motivations.
Yeah, and this really kind of contributed to this perception that, a lot of the activities within SHGs, that this was women's work, like it was part of the female domain. So men didn't necessarily feel responsible for things like, household tasks, childcare, or even a lot of the community issues that these self-help groups were trying to address.
Yeah, and it's interesting when researchers in Tajikistan asked women leaders, why did you become involved in SHGs? Why did you stay involved? So their responses were very often about necessity, like circumstances forced me, or I had no choice, I had to support my family, or, I've always been the one who takes responsibility.
Right. But when they asked men, they were more likely to talk about things like, I want to leave my mark, or I want to continue what my father did, like very different underlying motivations.
It is, and this reflects those those prevailing societal models of leadership. The report highlights that the common understanding of female leadership in SHGs, it's often rooted in that, that mother-housewife archetype, this idea that women are naturally more caring, they're naturally better at understanding social problems. And then conversely, you have the dominant male perception, which is that, men are just inherently better leaders and women are better suited to supportive roles.
Yeah, and you can see how those deeply ingrained gender stereotypes, how they become a major obstacle to achieving more equitable leadership.
Absolutely. And it's against this backdrop, all of these challenges, all of these complexities, that the From Self-Help to Leadership project really aimed to make a difference. They recognized that, for these self-help groups to really evolve, to become a more powerful force for change, to advocate for the needs of the poor, they needed to develop community leadership at all levels. Right. And they knew that this wouldn't happen without a more open and adaptable approach to leadership and without the active participation of both women and young people.
Yeah, exactly. The project really understood that, simply focusing on economic empowerment through microcredit, that wasn't enough. They needed to equip people with the skills, with the confidence to engage in broader social and political change.
And right from the start, they formed this really strong partnership with the Ishnum Network. Now, this is a group of NGOs that have been working for about a decade promoting self-help as a way to improve quality of life and amplify the voices of marginalized communities. And it's important to understand that, Ishnum always had this really broad view of self-help. It wasn't just about economics. It was about social well-being, cultural well-being, political, psychological, the whole package.
Oh, I see. So they had a very holistic approach.
Yeah, exactly. So this 2-year initiative, it ran from 2009 to 2010, and it specifically targeted young leaders with a real emphasis on young women within self-help groups in the northern regions of Kyrgyzstan. And they had 3 main goals.
Okay.
First, to provide those young leaders with, like a solid foundation in things like gender equality, the principles of leadership, the core concepts of self-help. Second, to get them actively involved in tackling issues within their own communities. And they did this through projects that used new technologies, what we now call social media, things like blogs and online platforms.
Oh, wow. So they were really on the cutting edge there.
Yeah. And third, to strengthen the connections and networks among those young people, both within the self-help movement and in their wider communities.
So really building those bonds.
Exactly. And the project had a very clear structure. NR3C provided the support and the resources, and then they had these local NGO partners who worked directly with the self-help groups and those young leaders.
Oh, I see.
Yeah, participants were initially selected through a competitive application process involving the SHGs, the NGOs, and other stakeholders. And those 6 local NGO partners were really crucial in supporting the participants as they developed and implemented their projects. Providing them with this initial 6-month training program, that kind of thing.
Okay, so it was a very hands-on, collaborative approach.
Exactly. And the project had to be adaptable too.
Right.
Because remember, in April 2010, the violence broke out in Kyrgyzstan, and there was this decision to really, to double down on the role that young people could play in stabilizing their communities, in preventing further conflict. So they even expanded the project, offering participants the chance to invite other active young people from their communities to join. The core principle stayed the same, though, which was that participants would develop and implement community-based projects. This was seen as a way to really solidify their learning, to make a tangible contribution while building their leadership skills and their confidence.
Yeah, that makes sense. So it was about learning by doing, by really engaging with their communities.
Exactly. And what's really interesting about from self-help to leadership is how different it was from like those traditional leadership training programs that Sontra had run before in Central Asia. The report highlights a few key distinctions. In the past, the focus might have been on an individual, maybe developing as a leader or manager within an existing NGO. But this project, it deliberately shifted the focus to cultivating leadership within the context of self-help groups and that broader social movement activism.
Right, right. So it was more about empowering a whole movement, not just individuals.
Exactly. And also, while previous programs maybe, gave limited attention to gender dynamics or specifically to fostering women's leadership, this project made those things central. It actively explored the power dynamics between genders. And it also moved away from, just relying on academic material, theoretical frameworks, and instead went for a more hands-on, action-oriented approach. Participants were actually designing and implementing projects, using new technologies, using social media.
So they were really putting theory into practice.
Exactly. And the focus on young people, that was a big shift too. And Troy Racy hadn't really run programs specifically targeting youth before. But because of the political situation, they saw that the leadership potential of young people was really, really crucial.
Right. And it's also worth noting, a lot of traditional leadership programs, they frame leadership as this individual achievement in a very competitive setting, which, let's be honest, can disadvantage women, can disadvantage young people who might not have the same networks or resources as more established figures. This project, it actively promoted this alternative understanding of leadership, one that was rooted in collaboration and mutual support.
Yeah, that's so important. And, they weren't disregarding individual skills either, but participants still worked on developing their own knowledge and perspectives. But the main emphasis was on building that collective leadership, on developing that kind of facilitative style rather than a top-down approach. And they also focused on equipping participants with the skills to really analyze what was happening in their own communities, the social and political processes at play. And a really forward-thinking element was this emphasis on mobilizing resources beyond just money. They were exploring the potential of social media as this new resource for community action.
Wow, that's really interesting. So let's get into some of the specifics. What were some of the activities the project used, and what did they learn along the way?
Okay, great question. Let's start with that transition from individual to collective leadership. The 5-day youth camp that they launched in 2009 was a really key part of this.
Okay.
It wasn't just about, individual skill building. It got into broader concepts of self-help, leadership, partnership, relationships between generations, traditional norms, gender roles, social change, it's like the whole gamut. And really importantly, they introduced participants to new information and communication technologies. So they were learning basic new media skills, brainstorming how to use those skills to tackle issues in their community.
Oh, so they were really encouraging them to think outside the box.
Exactly. And they had this, this blue sky idea generation session, just come up with any and all ideas, no matter how crazy, for how you can use these new media skills to tackle social problems. And then they had a youth camp talent show, which was this really smart way to encourage both individual self-expression and a sense of collective identity.
I love that.
Right, valuing everyone's unique abilities.
Yeah.
And they're really trying to broaden that definition of leadership beyond just a formal position, framing it as this active, ongoing way of engaging with your community.
So it was about being a leader in your everyday life, not just in a specific role.
Exactly. And building on that, the project later explored the role of a leader in connecting different groups and organizations. So after the April 2010 events, you saw all these new youth associations popping up, trying to address the instability. And the project really emphasized the importance of networking. Understanding who else is active in your community so you're not duplicating efforts or working at cross purposes. Facilitating dialogue, constructive dialogue between different groups that was seen as a crucial function of a leader.
Right, bringing people together.
Exactly. And this networking aspect was developed further in workshops that brought together participants from both the, relatively stable north and the more volatile south of Kyrgyzstan, including young people who had been involved in those humanitarian aid efforts after the interethnic clashes.
Oh, wow. So they were bridging those divides as well.
Yeah, they were. Now, it wasn't always smooth sailing. Right from the start, they had some difficulties recruiting participants, especially young people, given that they generally weren't as involved in existing self-help groups.
Makes sense. So how did they address that?
Well, they broadened the age range, which on the one hand, it fostered communication and support between generations, which is great.
Yeah.
But it also meant that they had to meet the needs of this really diverse group with different levels of understanding. Some younger participants didn't really know much about SHGs or what they did, and some struggled with the terminology used in, development and civil society work.
Yeah, all that jargon can be intimidating.
Totally.
Yeah.
So the project adapted. They started linking those abstract terms to real-world examples, using interactive games, relying on those face-to-face discussions to help people connect the dots.
Yeah, make it relevant to their lives.
Exactly. Now let's talk about their specific focus on women's leadership, youth engagement, and diversity. The project used practical exercises and interactive games to really delve into gender roles and stereotypes. One of their core aims was to address the fact that SHGs hadn't really had a big impact on gender equality. So these sessions were designed to encourage participants to really critically examine existing gender relations. And to think about, okay, what does effective, inclusive leadership look like in this context?
Right. And, addressing those authoritarian leadership styles that were so common in many SHGs, that was another key focus.
Yeah.
They framed leadership as this dynamic power relationship, and they explored the downsides of, overly authoritarian approaches. But they also looked at the potential pitfalls of other leadership styles as well. And crucially, they directly addressed those common myths about women's leadership, about youth leadership, all those misconceptions about power and hierarchy that often come up.
Yeah, and it's really interesting. The discussions revealed some differences in how men and women perceived the leadership.
Yeah. Oh, really?
Yeah. Male participants, they often emphasized, the practical problem-solving side of things, like dealing with infrastructure. Whereas female participants tended to highlight the human dimension, building relationships, motivating people, creating that sense of inclusion.
That's fascinating.
Yeah. And the discussions around gender and religion, those were important too. You had male participants expressing more overtly religious viewpoints, and then some women voiced concerns about the potential impact of, growing religious influence on their own opportunities, on their freedoms.
That's a really sensitive topic.
It is.
Yeah.
But the trainers, they adopted this really open and respectful approach, acknowledging that these are important factors that, local leaders would have to navigate. And they also integrated discussions on gender and youth issues into this broader concept of diversity, which was especially important given the tensions in the region.
Yeah.
And it's encouraging to see that participants who had been involved in earlier workshops, they were much more comfortable discussing these sometimes sensitive topics.
That's great.
Yeah, it is. But ensuring consistent participation from women, that wasn't always easy. Many women had huge challenges leaving their families, finding childcare for the training sessions, so the project tried to be flexible. There was even one case where they supported a participant to bring her child to the training, and language was a barrier too.
Oh, yeah?
Yeah. Russian was the main working language, although they often used Kyrgyz for discussions to ensure that everyone could understand and participate.
Okay, so they were really trying to remove those barriers.
They were. Now, a really crucial part of this whole project was this emphasis on practical project work. This is where the learning really came to life.
Right, putting it all into action.
Exactly. Each participant, they had to identify a problem in their community, come up with a plan to address it, and then actually implement that project. Initially, the guidelines were pretty broad. The project had to contribute to the self-help movement in some way, challenge gender stereotypes, use new technologies, and reflect issues relevant to young people and SHGs. And this broad approach led to some really amazing, diverse, and innovative projects.
Yeah. Can you give us some examples? I'm really curious to hear what they came up with.
Oh, absolutely. There's a whole section in the report called Raising Gender and Youth Issues, and it's just packed with great examples. So you had the creation of the Kunush Karakteri blog, which gave a voice to residents in these newly developed areas of Bishkek. They were talking about everything from home security to healthcare to bride kidnapping. They even had a special column for youth issues.
Wow, that's great.
Yeah. And then there was this project focused on teaching new technology skills to teenagers, empowering them to create their own blogs about bullying, extortion, those kinds of things. And the Tongzashtari blog, this one served as a platform for young people in rural areas to share their experiences. And it actually became a resource for local youth services.
Oh, that's fantastic.
Yeah, it is. And young people in one village, they got together to make this social video documenting the rising groundwater levels, which was a big problem for them. And there was this really powerful photo exhibition called Zashtiktin Nuru that raised awareness about the realities of rural youth life.
And I love the sound of that Babushki Viatek blog.
Oh yeah, the Babushki Viatek blog, it was great. It challenged those stereotypes about older women, and it even helped them market and sell their products online. And then you had another really impactful project that taught photography skills to working children in Bishkek. This was to help them advocate for their rights, and it culminated in this public exhibition of their photos. Yeah, and then there was this more personal project where children living in a family support home, they created their own photo exhibition called My Childhood in the Lens.
Oh, that's really powerful.
Yeah, it really showcased the creativity and the range of issues that these participants chose to tackle.
It's amazing what they accomplished.
Yeah. Later in the project, they shifted the focus of these mini projects a bit to address the needs of youth specifically and to conduct situation analyses in their communities. This was partly in response to those major political events that had happened. But for a lot of SHG members developing these projects, it was a totally new experience. So the project provided specific training and ongoing mentoring in project design and management. They also trained them on how to analyze the results of their projects and how to present those findings effectively. And importantly, they organized these feedback sessions with NGO and SHG leaders, which gave those young participants such valuable feedback.
Right, so they were learning the whole process from start to finish.
Exactly. Now, the project also made a real push to introduce and promote the use of social media as a tool for community action and advocacy. The idea was that these new platforms, they could provide a space for vulnerable groups to have their voices heard, to potentially even get the attention of local officials. And this approach really resonated with both women and young people. It offered them new ways to develop their skills and share their perspectives.
Yeah, that makes sense. So it was about giving them those tools to amplify their message.
Exactly. Now, of course, there were challenges with social media, too. Limited IT literacy, unequal access to technology, computers, cameras, reliable internet. These were big obstacles, especially in rural areas. And even within NGOs where they had better resources, the strategic use of new media for advocacy was still pretty new. And surprisingly, the project found that men weren't necessarily more IT literate than women.
Really? That is surprising.
It is, and it underscores how important basic education is for everyone. So to overcome these tech hurdles, they organized these practical masterclasses on online blogging, digital photography, basic video making. The training was very hands-on, focused on the practical side of things, but they also stressed the importance of planning the content first. Like, what message do you want to get across? And over time, photography really emerged as the most easily adopted medium, especially in those rural areas where resources were scarce.
Okay, so they were adapting to the realities on the ground.
Exactly. And when you look at the overall results of the project, it's clear they made a lot of progress in opening up those discussions about gender, age, and diversity. Those participatory methods they used, those mixed gender and mixed age groups, they really fostered more open and honest dialogue. And while the women often found the content more immediately relevant to their lives, both men and women said they benefited from those discussions. The project created this safe space for women to discuss the social issues that were important to them, which, as we talked about, sometimes contrasted with the men's focus on more economic matters. And importantly, they were able to address those really sensitive political topics related to conflict and power. And many of the participants actually became involved in community networks and initiatives after those April 2010 events.
That's great to hear. So they were really empowered to take action.
They were. And those community-based mini projects, they genuinely succeeded in raising awareness about important issues. For example, that video from the Kevin district that talked about bride stealing, it sparked all these local discussions. Yeah, it was really powerful. And the Zashtiktin Nuru project, remember the photo exhibition? Well, that evolved into a tool for conducting community needs assessments and advocating for better IT facilities for young people. So it really shows how these local initiatives can grow and have a real impact.
It's amazing how something that starts as a simple project can really take on a life of its own.
It is. And the project also played a vital role in the development of the self-help movement as a whole. It helped NGOs move beyond that traditional model of just providing credit. encouraging them to foster more dynamic social movements that tackle the wider range of issues. And it gave women and young people a chance to explore different leadership styles, which undoubtedly had an impact on the dynamics within some SHGs. Transforming a whole social movement, that's a long process. But this project, it definitely brought in valuable new approaches.
Absolutely. So what were some of the key lessons, those overarching conclusions that came out of this project?
Well, the report highlights several really important points. First, having an open and inclusive recruitment process is absolutely crucial. Making sure that marginalized groups actually have the opportunity to participate. Second, empowerment programs need to identify emerging leaders and provide them with ongoing support and mentorship. Third, promoting those facilitative leadership styles, building on the skills that people in marginalized communities already have, that's essential.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I imagine they learned a lot about the importance of analyzing the external environment, right? Like understanding how the specific context impacts women and young people.
Exactly. They did these local mapping exercises, which were really valuable for that. And they explicitly tried to include and address men's concerns alongside women's, which they found to be really essential and successful. But the report also acknowledges that fostering and sustaining those alternative, more egalitarian leadership models within NGOs and SHGs, that's an ongoing challenge, especially when there are so many other priorities.
Right. It's about changing those deeply ingrained patterns.
Yeah, absolutely. And they really highlighted the crucial role of group work, especially when you're dealing with complex issues like gender dynamics and power relations. Alongside individual activities, those group discussions are so important. And they showed the amazing potential of new media, those digital technologies, as a way to empower young people and women, to challenge those traditional norms, to give them a platform. And the report stresses that we need to dedicate more time and resources to specifically promoting youth and women's leadership within that wider self-help movement.
Yeah, that's a key takeaway.
It is. And they also found that photography and video, those accessible mediums, they're incredibly powerful for achieving social change in those rural areas where internet access might be limited. And building that wider solidarity, those connections with other organizations and networks, that's essential too.
Yeah, it's about breaking down those silos.
Exactly. So to wrap up our deep dive today, we've seen how women in Central Asia, despite their active involvement in self-help groups, they often faced significant barriers when it came to taking on broader leadership roles and challenging those deeply ingrained gender norms. Young people were largely missing from these groups, and From Self-Help to Leadership project, it directly addressed these challenges. They used innovative strategies, particularly that focus on using social media and fostering collective leadership, and they actively engaged both women and young people.
What I find so impressive is how well they understood the local context.
Yeah.
Those existing power dynamics, the specific challenges facing women and youth, and that action-oriented approach using technology to amplify voices and encourage collective action, that's a blueprint for so many other initiatives around the world.
It really is. And it makes you think, doesn't it? So for you, our listener, think about this. What are the biggest barriers to achieving true leadership equality in your own world, in your own community, in your own workplace? And drawing on what we've learned today about using new technologies, what are some maybe unconventional ways that we can break down those barriers? Think about how grassroots movements, whether they're small and local or part of a bigger network, how can they use both, that traditional wisdom and those modern tools to create real and lasting change?
Yeah, that's a great question to ponder.
It is. It is.